The card got declined at the Whole Foods on Beacon Street. I was standing in line behind a woman with a toddler, holding a single bag of organic spinach and a rotisserie chicken, and the cashier, a kid maybe 19 years old, said it twice before I understood him. "Ma'am, card's not going through. You want to try another one?" I stared at him. I'd been paid that Friday, $4,200, direct deposit, my engineering salary at the biotech firm in Cambridge, where I'd worked for 6 years. There was no reason that card should decline. "Try it again," I said. He did, same red screen. I pulled out my phone, opened the banking app, and saw it. Available balance, $14.27. I checked the transactions. 3 withdrawals at an ATM in Quincy that morning. A purchase at Macy's. A DoorDash order for $187. None of them mine. I left the spinach on the conveyor belt and walked out of the store. My name is Hannah. I'm 31 years old. I live in a 4-bedroom colonial in Newton, Massachusetts. And 3 weeks before that grocery store moment, my husband's mother had told me, with a soft, regretful smile, that she'd found a wonderful temporary solution for her sister and 2 adult nephews who had nowhere else to go. That solution was my house, and I had smiled and said yes, because I had already decided what I was going to do. Let me back up. I met my husband, I'll call him Daniel, at a wedding in Vermont when I was 26. He was a hospital administrator, 2 years older, the kind of man who held doors and called his mother every Sunday. I thought that was sweet at the time. My own mother had died when I was 19, and I think part of me looked at his closeness to his mom and saw something I'd lost. I didn't see it for what it actually was, which is that he had never, in 33 years, made a decision his mother disagreed with. His mother, I'll call her Margaret, was a retired second-grade teacher who lived in a 3-bedroom ranch in Quincy that her late husband had left her, fully paid off, worth somewhere north of $600,000 in the current market. She had a pension, Social Security, and what Daniel once let slip was a pretty decent investment portfolio his father had built. She was 68, in good health, drove a Lexus, and went to Florida every February. She was not, by any reasonable definition, in need. The house in Newton was mine. I want to be clear about that, because it matters later. I bought it 3 years before I met Daniel, with the inheritance from my mother and savings from my first job out of MIT. I'd put $200,000 down. The mortgage was in my name. The deed was in my name. When Daniel and I got married, I'd asked my lawyer about adding him, and she'd said, gently, the way lawyers do when they're trying to talk you out of something, "Hannah, let's wait. You can always add him later. You can never unadd him." I'd waited. 5 years of marriage and I had still never added him. He'd asked once, 2 years in. I'd said something vague about taxes and he'd let it drop. I think now he just assumed it would happen eventually. It was a Tuesday in early March when my mother-in-law called me at work. "Hannah, honey, do you have a minute?" I stepped out of a meeting because she rarely called me at work, and when she did, it was usually because Daniel hadn't been answering and she needed something done. "My sister Diane," she said. "You remember Diane?" I did remember Diane. I met her twice. She was 61, divorced for the 3rd time, and lived in a 1-bedroom condo in Braintree that, according to family rumor, she was about to lose because she hadn't paid the HOA fees in 8 months. "Diane is going through such a hard time," Margaret said. "And her son Kevin. You know Kevin? He just turned 26. He got laid off from the warehouse job. And his sister Brittany, she's 23. She had a falling out with her roommate in Alston. They're all just in this terrible spot." I waited. I knew what was coming. I just didn't know yet exactly how she was going to dress it up. "I had the most wonderful idea," she said. "Your house. You have all that space. 4 bedrooms, and you and Daniel only use 1. It would just be temporary, sweetheart. Family helps family. And I know you have such a generous heart." I sat down on the bench outside the conference room. "Margaret," I said carefully, "that's a lot of people. That's 3 additional adults." "Oh, it would be no time at all. A few months. Maybe through the summer. Kevin's already got leads on new jobs, and Brittany is going to start looking for an apartment, and Diane just needs to get back on her feet. You know how it is. I knew how it was. I'd watched Margaret help Diane get back on her feet for the entire 5 years I'd been married to her son. Diane had never in that time been on her feet? Why not your house, I asked. There was the smallest pause. Oh, honey, you know my back, and the stairs, and I have my routine. Plus, your house is just so much more accommodating. You have the finished basement, the guest rooms. It really is the most logical solution. The most logical solution. 3 strangers in my house for an unspecified amount of time, eating my food, using my utilities, while she, with her empty 3-bedroom ranch in Quincy, sat on her couch watching Hallmark movies. Let me talk to Daniel, I said. Oh, I already did. He thinks it's a wonderful idea. Of course he did. That evening I made dinner, chicken piccata, his favorite, and I waited until he'd had 2 glasses of wine before I asked him about it. Your mom called me today. He didn't look up from his plate. Yeah? She mentioned she was going to. She wants Diane, Kevin, and Brittany to move in. Here. For a few months. It's family, Hannah. It's not my family. He set down his fork. And here's the thing I'll never forget. He didn't look angry. He didn't look conflicted. He looked annoyed. Like I was being difficult about something obvious. They have nowhere to go, he said. Diane has a sister with an empty house 20 minutes from here. Mom can't do it. You know her back. Her back doesn't stop her from playing pickleball 3 times a week, Daniel. He sighed. The long, performative sigh that meant I was being unreasonable and he was going to have to be patient with me. Look, he said. Mom already told them they could come. They're packing up this weekend. I really don't want to make this a thing. I sat very still. You already said yes, I said. I said we'd figure it out. Which we are, right now. I looked at my husband across our dining room table, the table I had bought, in the dining room of the house I owned, and I felt something inside me go very quiet and very cold. It wasn't rage. Rage is hot. This was something else. This was the feeling you get when a tooth that's been aching for a long time finally cracks all the way through, and the pain gives way to something clearer. I smiled at him. I felt my face do it. You're right, I said. I'm being silly. Of course they can come. He looked at me, surprised, then relieved. Really? Really? Family helps family. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Thank you, babe. I knew you'd come around. I went to bed at 9:30 that night, citing a headache. Then I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and I made a list in my head. The next morning, I called out sick from work, drove to a coffee shop in Watertown where no one I knew would be, and called Eleanor Pierce. Eleanor had been my mother's college roommate. She was now a senior partner at a family law firm in Boston, and she had told me at my mother's funeral when I was 19 that if I ever needed anything, I was to call her. I had never called her. Until that morning. I told her everything. The marriage, the mother-in-law, the house, the deed, the plan for the relatives. I told her about Daniel's salary versus mine. He made about $90,000 at the hospital. I made $220+ bonus at the biotech firm. I told her about the joint checking account we used for shared expenses, the separate savings accounts, the credit cards. Eleanor listened. Then she asked me 3 questions. Is the house in his name in any capacity? No. Has he contributed to the mortgage? No. I've paid the mortgage from my personal account every month. Do you want a divorce? I sat in that coffee shop with my hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold, and I thought about it. Really thought about it. Not what would be easy. Not what would hurt the least. What I actually wanted. I don't know yet, I said, but I want my options open. All of them. Good answer, she said. Here's what we're going to do. By Friday, I had a new individual checking account at a credit union Daniel didn't know about. My direct deposit was rerouted. I had pulled $40,000 out of our joint savings, exactly half, which was my legal right, and moved it to my new account. I had frozen my credit card, the one Daniel had an authorized user card for, and opened a new one in only my name. I had downloaded 6 months of bank statements, screenshotted every text where Margaret had asked Daniel for money, and saved them to a folder in my personal email. I had also called my homeowner's insurance and asked, hypothetically, what would happen if guests staying in my home damaged the property. The agent had a lot of useful things to say. That Saturday, Diane, Kevin, and Brittany moved in. I helped carry boxes. I smiled. I showed Diane to the larger guest bedroom on the second floor, Brittany to the smaller one across the hall, and Kevin to the finished basement, which had its own half bath. I told them to make themselves at home. I made lasagna for dinner that night, 6 servings, and we all sat at my dining room table, and Diane talked for 40 minutes about her ex-husband. Kevin scrolled on his phone the entire meal. Brittany asked if we had any almond milk. We didn't, and seemed personally affronted. Daniel beamed at me across the table. "See?" his eyes said. "Isn't this nice?" I smiled back. The first week, I observed, I watched Diane help herself to the wine I'd been saving for my birthday. I watched Kevin order DoorDash 3 times in 4 days on the household credit card, which I had quietly removed from the family Amazon account, the family Instacart account, and the family DoorDash account, replacing it with a prepaid Visa that had exactly $200 on it. I watched Brittany take 3 40-minute showers a day and leave wet towels on the hardwood floor of the hallway. I watched Margaret come over for dinner on Sunday uninvited, and watched her open my refrigerator like she owned it. I watched my husband say nothing. On Monday of the second week, I came home from work to find Diane in my home office. My home office. The room I'd specifically told her on day 1 was off limits because I had confidential work materials in it. She was sitting at my desk on my laptop scrolling through what appeared to be Facebook. "Oh, hi, honey," she said, not getting up. My tablet was running slow, and I just needed to check something real quick. "You don't mind, do you?" I stood in the doorway. "How did you get the password?" "Oh, Daniel gave it to me. He said it would be fine." I went and found Daniel in the den. He was watching a Celtics game. "You gave Diane my laptop password. She just needed to check something, Hen." "That laptop has my work on it. I sign NDAs. There are clinical trial documents on there. Relax. She's not gonna look at anything." I went upstairs, took my laptop back, and changed every password I owned. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and I called Eleanor. "It's happening faster than I thought," I said. "Are you ready?" "Almost. 2 more weeks." "Hannah," she said, "just say the word." I waited. I needed Margaret to do one more thing first. I needed her to do the thing she always did. She did it 12 days later. I came home on a Thursday evening, and Margaret was sitting in my living room with a stack of mail in her lap. My mail. She had let herself in with the key Daniel had given her without my permission 3 years earlier. "Hannah, sweetheart, we need to talk." I set down my bag. "This isn't working," she said, gesturing vaguely. "It's too crowded. Diane needs her own space. Brittany has been crying. Kevin says the basement is damp. And honestly, sweetheart, you've been a little chilly to them. They feel like they're imposing." "They are imposing." She smiled the patient smile. "I've been thinking," she said, "what if you went and stayed at your father's place in Concord for a while? Just a few weeks. Give everyone room to breathe. Daniel can hold down the fort here, and you can have some space. I really think it would be best for everyone." I looked at her. I looked at her sitting on my couch in my house, telling me to leave my home so that her sister could have more room. My father lives in a 1-bedroom apartment over a hardware store in Concord. He has a fold-out couch in his living room. He is 74 years old and has Parkinson's. "You want me to move out," I said slowly, "of my own house, so Diane can have more room, just temporarily. And it's not really your house, is it, honey? It's the family's house." There it was. "Daniel agrees with you. He thinks it's a wonderful idea. He says you've been so stressed at work, and a little time at your father's would do you good." I felt my face do the thing again. The smile. "Margaret," I said, "you're absolutely right." She brightened. "Oh, sweetheart, I knew you'd see reason. I'll pack a bag tonight. Take your time. There's no rush, and honey, you'll see, this is going to bring us all so much closer." I packed 2 suitcases. I packed my passport, my birth certificate, my mother's wedding ring, the deed to the house, my work laptop, and every piece of paperwork I'd been quietly assembling for 3 weeks. I packed my favorite cast iron pan because I'd had it for 10 years and Diane had already chipped it. I left my wedding ring on the nightstand. I drove to a hotel in Cambridge, not my father's. Eleanor had been very clear that I should not stay with family. I checked in. I ordered room service. I called Eleanor. "Tomorrow," I said. "Tomorrow," she said. The next morning, Friday at 9 a.m., a process server arrived at my house in Newton. He served Daniel with divorce papers and 3 other documents, a formal notice that Diane, Kevin, and Brittany were unauthorized occupants of a property they had no legal right to inhabit, a 30-day notice to vacate, and a temporary restraining order preventing Daniel from removing any property from the home except his personal belongings. At 9:15, the joint checking account was frozen pending the divorce. I had already moved my half. The remaining balance, about $3,000, mostly his recent paycheck, was locked. At 9:30, the credit card Diane had been using was canceled because it had only ever been in my name. Daniel had been an authorized user. Margaret had never been on it at all, but Diane had been quietly using the card with Daniel's name on it that he had handed her without asking me. At 9:45, I got a phone call. It was Margaret. I let it go to voicemail. She called again and again. By 11 a.m., she had called 14 times. Daniel had called 9. Diane had called 6. Kevin had called once, probably by accident. I listened to one voicemail. Margaret's voice, no longer warm. "Hannah, what did you do?" "The card is declined. I'm at the Whole Foods." "What are we all supposed to eat? You cannot just do this to us. Call me back right now. Do you hear me? Right now." I deleted it. At noon, Eleanor called. "Daniel's lawyer reached out," she said. "He wants to negotiate. He doesn't have anything to negotiate with." "I know." I told him that more politely. The next 2 weeks were almost peaceful. I stayed at the hotel for 3 nights, then moved into a furnished, short-term rental in Brookline that I'd lined up before any of this started. I went to work. I worked out. I called my dad and told him what was happening, and he said, "Took you long enough, kiddo," which made me laugh until I cried. Daniel sent me 63 text messages in the first week. They progressed predictably. Confusion, anger, hurt, negotiation, pleading. Anger, hurt, negotiation, pleading. By message 40, he was telling me his mother was sick from the stress. By message 50, he was telling me his mother had been right. I was unstable. By message 60, he was asking if we could just talk. I didn't respond. Eleanor handled everything. The 30-day notice ran out. Diane, Kevin, and Brittany, having found exactly nowhere else to go because Margaret would not, in fact, take them in, had to leave. Diane ended up in a motel in Weymouth. Kevin moved in with a friend. Brittany, I heard, went back to the roommate she'd fallen out with. Margaret, apparently, was furious with all of them. Daniel had 30 days to vacate the house, too. He fought it at first. His lawyer tried to argue marital interest in the property. Eleanor presented 61 months of mortgage statements drawn entirely from my personal account, the original deed from before our marriage, and a forensic accounting showing that Daniel had never once contributed to the property in any way. He moved out on day 29. He moved in with Margaret in Quincy, in the 3-bedroom ranch with the empty bedrooms that had somehow never been an option for Diane. The divorce took 8 months. He got his car, his clothes, his retirement account, and half of the joint savings, which, since I'd moved my half preemptively, came out to about $3,000 after legal fees. He got no alimony because he made enough on his own. He got nothing from the house. He signed the papers in November. I moved back into my house the week after Thanksgiving. I want to tell you about that first night. The house was a mess. They'd been gone for months, but Daniel had been living in it alone for a few weeks at the end, and he had not been keeping it up. There were dishes in the sink. There were stains on the carpet in the guest room where Diane had been. Kevin had punched a hole in the drywall of the basement before he left, and Daniel hadn't fixed it. I walked through every room slowly. I opened every window. I took down the photos of Daniel and me from the mantel and put them in a box. I took down the framed family portrait Margaret had given us as a wedding gift, the one with her in the center, and I put it in the box too. I'd deal with the box later. Then I went into the kitchen. The kitchen had always been my favorite room in this house. South-facing windows, a butcher block island I'd installed myself the first year I lived there, a 6-burner gas range that I'd saved up for. When Diane lived here, she had rearranged every cabinet. She'd thrown out 3 of my cast-iron pans because she said they were dirty. She'd put my good knives in the dishwasher. I had bought new pans the week before. I had a new set of knives in a box in the trunk of my car. I brought them in. I opened the cabinets and I put everything back where it belonged, my pans where I wanted them, my knives in the block by the stove, my mother's old wooden spoons in the crock by the range, my salt and my pepper, my olive oil, my cast iron seasoning. I made myself a grilled cheese sandwich. I ate it standing at the island, looking out at the backyard, where the maple tree my mother had planted from a seedling 30 years ago was just starting to drop its last leaves. The kitchen was quiet. The house was quiet. There was no Diane complaining about almond milk. There was no Kevin watching YouTube at full volume. There was no Margaret letting herself in with a key. I had changed the locks 3 days earlier. I sat down at my kitchen table, my table in my house, and I opened my laptop and I started a list. Things I wanted to do to the house. A new paint color in the living room, refinish the floors in the guest room, plant tulip bulbs in November the way my mother used to. I am 32 years old now. The divorce was finalized 14 months ago. I still live in the house in Newton. I have not spoken to Daniel since the day he signed the papers. I have not spoken to Margaret since the morning she called me from the Whole Foods. I heard, through a cousin, that Diane is back in her condo, that Kevin got another warehouse job, that Brittany is engaged to someone Margaret doesn't approve of, that Daniel is still living in his mother's basement. People ask me sometimes if I regret how I handled it, if I wish I had given him a chance, if I wish I had said something instead of smiling. I tell them the truth. I tell them that the dangerous people in your life are not the ones who scream. The dangerous people are the ones who keep smiling at you while they decide what they're going to do next. And the smartest thing I ever did was learn how to be one of them, exactly once, when it mattered. The house is mine. The kitchen is mine. The life is mine. That's the reason I smiled. I've thought about that grocery store moment more times than I can count. Standing there with a bag of spinach and a rotisserie chicken, watching that 19-year-old cashier try my card a second time, and realizing, not with panic, but with a strange, clean kind of clarity, that my own husband had handed the keys to my life to people who were never going to give them back. Here's what I've come to understand. Every single thing that happened to Margaret, to Daniel, to Diane and Kevin and Brittany, every single consequence was something they built themselves, brick by brick, over years. Margaret didn't wake up one morning and decide to throw me out of my own house. She had been testing the edges of what I would tolerate for 5 years, and every time I let something slide for the sake of peace, she took that as permission to push further. The locked card, the frozen account, the divorce papers. None of that was revenge in the way people sometimes mean the word. It was just the bill finally arriving for choices they had been making for a very long time, and I had to face my own part in it too. I had let it happen. I had smiled and softened and made excuses because I thought being agreeable was the same thing as being good. It isn't. There is a kind of kindness that costs you nothing, and there is a kind that costs you your whole life. And learning to tell the difference took me until I was 31. If I could go back and say one thing to the woman I used to be, the one making chicken piccata and hoping her husband would defend her without being asked, I would tell her this: your goodness is not measured by how much of yourself you give away. A person with no boundaries is not generous. She is just disappearing in slow motion, and the people benefiting from her disappearance will never tell her to stop. The strength I found that night, lying in the dark, making a list in my head, was not anger. Anger burns out. What I found was something steadier. It was the willingness to stop performing the version of myself that other people wanted, and to start protecting the version of myself I actually was. That takes a different kind of courage than yelling. It takes the patience to plan, the discipline to wait, and the honesty to admit when someone you love is not who you wanted them to be. I still have the wooden spoons my mother left me. They sit in a crock by the stove in my kitchen, in my house, in the life I chose to keep. And every time I cook now, I think about how easily I almost lost all of it. Not to a stranger, not to a disaster, but to my own quiet, well-meaning agreement to keep the peace. The peace was never the goal. The goal was always the truth. I just had to find out the hard way.